As Dan mentioned before, I know that the rain has probably gotten some of you down, but it could be worse, and it has been worse for most of the last 6 months. If you're from the Middle West, the Northeast, or the Southeast, you know that the winter of 2013-14 was one of the worst that we can ever remember, and I have to tell you, it created some stress in my marriage. There was one morning I had to catch a flight, and it was about 4:30 in the morning. I left my garage, and 6 fresh inches of powder had been deposited on my driveway. I didn't have time to clear it. So when I got to the airport, I sent my wife a text message that said, "You need to shovel the driveway." How many of you have ever sent a message that you regretted sending almost from the moment you hit the send key? As I'm told this is a dignified and refined crowd, I won't share with you the full content of my wife's response, only to say that it did involve a shovel. So, more than most, I'm very happy that winter is over, and I will take the rain as an alternative. And as I'll try and convince you this morning, the economy also seems to be moving past what was a rough winter, and hopefully as the spring turns into summer, the heat that is generated in the economy will expand commensurately. So I've entitled my remarks this morning, Turning the Corner, which is hopefully the description of what we'll be doing over the next few months in a manner that hopefully will bring benefit to all of your plans. I'm going to talk about 4 things today. First of all, as I've mentioned before, using the weather metaphor once again, I think some of the things that have been holding us back are now at our backs, and hopefully will bring the United States to a level that we'd all find more suitable. Second, I'm going to try and convince a skeptical crowd that fiscal policy in the United States, while not perfect, is in much better position than it was just 4 years ago. Third, I used to work at the Federal Reserve. I am here to accept blame from all of you for any slight that the Fed has inflicted on any of you. How many of you, by a show of hands, are upset that interest rates are so low? This is a pension crowd, right? Okay, think of the discounting of your liabilities. Anyway, we'll get back to interest rates then. And I'll highlight at the end a couple of things that are keeping me awake at night, both of them coming from the international arena. And for those who have been running pensions for a long time, you know that things that happen far away have a nasty habit every now and then of coming home to roost. Let me begin by describing where we are in the business cycle. Everybody, we've had an economic expansion in the United States that's lasted almost 5 full years. But let me ask for a show of hands across the crowd. How many of you think that the economy is doing really, really well? Somewhat well? Okay? All right, not very well? Still in the dumps? Anyway, that's a common sentiment that I hear because our economic performance has not met the standard that we are used to. In a good year, everybody, our national income, or our gross domestic product, that's just the value of all the goods and services that we make in the United States, will expand by about 3% after we adjust for inflation. But we've struggled to hit that mark since we got out of the great financial crisis in 2008. And normally when we have an expansion, growth would be much more rapid and bring everything back to normal much more rapidly. Instead, we've been treated to subpar performance. Fortunately, as I mentioned before there on the left, the weather, which brought some of the economic readings down during the winter months, are coming back, and so we don't have that to look at. But the great challenge in front of us still is that we have a number of people who remain unemployed. The official measure of unemployment released by the Labor Department shows that joblessness in the United States has come down from 10% to 6.7%, which sounds like and is a notable achievement. But I would point out that in the 4 prior recessions to this one, we did not get to a peak of unemployment that was 6.7%. When you decompose it, everyone, we still have about 3.5 million people who have not worked in 26 weeks or longer. We have a community of people who have given up looking for work, at least temporarily, and stepped back from the labor force. And when you begin to add those 2 things back, you get jobless readings that are well over 10%, representing not just an opportunity, but an obligation for policymakers who are trying to steer our economy back to where it needs to be. As I mentioned before, Some of the labor force participation, which is simply the number of people working plus the number of people actively looking for work divided by the population. Everybody with me? Economists have been expecting that to decline for quite a while. And as this is a pension audience, I don't need to tell you about demographics that find the baby boomers reaching 62, 65, or 67, and at those levels, they're much less likely to look for work. So the red line kind of captures the time trend of what we expect simply from the aging of the American population. But beyond that, you can see that we've had a number of able-bodied, working-age women and men who have left the labor force, particularly because prospects are not there. Now, part of this is a good story. People are going back to become re-educated to find their way back into the labor force, but I think there could be much more done and should be done in order to get people back into the workforce where they can continue their careers, earn an income, and from a fiscal perspective, add substantially to the national income. Now, here's why I think this is likely to happen as we move through the remainder of the year. First, we've had an amazing rally in the equity markets since hitting the bottom in the early part of 2009. Major world equity indices are up by 2.5 times what they were at that point. What that has done is reversed what had been a $14 trillion loss of home equity and stock equity that challenged a number of households. Today, net worth of the American households in aggregate is back to a record level, and what that initiates is what economists call a wealth effect. Simply that when you see your portfolio statement and it's doing well, you're much more likely to buy a car, buy a home, or other things. So that should be a very powerful support for consumer spending as we move through the balance of the year. Secondly, there were a number of households who found themselves with far too much debt as we came through the Great Recession. The yellow line on that left-hand chart represents the ratio of household debt to household income, a very simple one, and showing that in the United States, that metric is back down to where it was in 2002, meaning that a lot of families have done the hard business of getting their debt back under control and putting themselves back in a position to participate in the economy in more normal ways. They can take vacations, they can have a meal out. All of that is going to be very positive to economic activity. And as I mentioned before, consumer spending, which is about 2/3 of our economy, has been doing quite well. Now, let me again make the hopefully valiant attempt to talk about fiscal policy. In 2009, at the federal level, the United States had a deficit of almost $1.4 trillion, or about 10% of our national income. Today, that number is less than 4%, and it's falling. And we've gotten there through a number of ways. Nobly, we've increased economic activity, and that's created revenue that we might not have expected. And secondly, however clumsy, there has been a modicum of spending discipline in the capital, which has brought some programs to a lower rate of growth and made them more sustainable. That said, whatever you might think of government spending, and all of us have our opinions on what's good and what's bad, the fact is that it is very stimulative to economic activity. And it's estimated that because of the severity of government belt-tightening, economic growth in the United States would have been a full 1% higher last year had they simply stayed at current levels. The outlines of the 2014 budget and the 2015 budget have been agreed to after what I thought was a very disappointing, embarrassing episode last October where the government was shut for 2 weeks and where we nearly defaulted on the national debt. We have relative peace in Washington thanks to cooler heads prevailing last December and January. And the degree of belt-tightening called for is somewhat more modest, and therefore it leaves room for the types of spending that will help to grow our economy. And encouragingly, we're seeing the same things in many places at the state and the local level where tax receipts have enabled a reinvestment in education, in their communities, and yes, hopefully, in the solvency of their pension systems. Now, all of that sounds very good, but I've been on the road quite a bit, and my clients will very frequently ask, Carl, it's nice that we're cutting the deficit, but when are we going to start cutting the debt? And that's really the tougher question, isn't it? because at the national level and also at some state and local levels, the projections are that as the baby boom continues to retire, the challenge faced by public debt is going to be significant. Less so, I think, from pensions and Social Security, which often come up first, what, in a fiscal sense, stand a distant second to the challenges that we have in the American healthcare system. I think I have a chart on this. We spend 18% of our national income on healthcare, and that number is going to grow to 25%. It is projected over the next 20 years. That is approximately twice what the average developed country spends on healthcare. And while whether measured by life expectancy, infant mortality, or the incidence of chronic disease, people from both sides of the aisle readily agree that the cost-benefit equation in American healthcare is something that requires some attention. It is out of alignment. And if we do not get those alignments back together, the challenge faced by our government is going to end up putting a lot of burden on our children and our grandchildren. The tax rates that my kids may end up paying when they are my age, if we are unable to get our arms around this, are so high that they will not want to make an invention, start a company, and even at that level, high tax rates are a disincentive to work. And let me tell you, my children do not need any more disincentives to work. You try getting one of them out to mow the grass, I'm telling you. But anyway, I joke sometimes as a defense mechanism to avoid getting upset about a very significant problem. I know that many of you are engaged in the great effort to try and get health care under control. We could be here all day debating it, but I just wish you success because we're all going to need it. Now let me go back to that show of hands. How many of you are upset that interest rates are so low? Okay. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait in line because my number one client is my 82-year-old mother. How many of you help a relative with financial planning? Quite a few. Isn't it the most thankless job that there is? You know, if the portfolio does well, you know, it's the acumen of the covered. And if the portfolio does poorly, it's always the manager's fault. My mother and I had our annual portfolio review on the occasion of filing her tax return a few weeks ago. My mother retired at 62. In one of my rare inspirations in financial management. Because her parents lived into their 90s, I left her in equities, and so now she is making 25% more as a retired person than she ever made working. Is she happy about that? No, she's not. There's a little piece of her portfolio that's still in bank CDs, and every time one comes due, it has a nasty habit of pricing downward. This created a lot of stress in our relationship. Back to when I was at the Fed working in Washington, there was an occasion where the phone rang at my desk one day, and just from the way that it rang, I knew that it was my mother and that she wasn't happy. She explained that the bank branch manager had called her and said, "Mrs. Tannenbaum, you have a CD that's coming due." It was a 4% CD. In a cheerful voice, he continued, "You are in luck because today we have a special. We can roll you over at 50 basis points. Now, Mom's hearing's not perfect anymore, so she thought she heard 50%. So she's getting ready to instruct me to liquidate all of their holdings, and no, ma'am, he explains, that's 1/2 of 1%, 50 basis points. And this is where she became upset and called me up. And in her own roundabout way, it was clear what she wanted me to do was one of two things. Either march down the hall into Ben Bernanke's office and tell him that interest rates needed to go up immediately, or to use my powers as a vast supervisor of banks and order her bank to pay her 4%. Well, neither one of those was really within my power. But I'm happy to report to all of you that my mother is still getting 4%. She's getting 50 basis points from the bank and 3.5% from me. Now, this may sound like an embarrassing situation, but we're smiling at each other on the holidays. And I think, at some point it'll all come back to me. I should mention, by the way, hey now, I should mention, by the way, for those of you who are going to visit the Northern Trust booth later on during the conference, this offer is not available to all of our clients, so please don't ask my partners to replicate that. But what I told my mom is what we were mentioning when I was at the Fed, and they're still telling us, which is interest rates are low now in the hope that the economy performs better, allowing interest rates to go back to more normal levels. In the wake of the crisis, the Federal Reserve brought short-term rates down to zero and began a program of buying long-term securities to lead long-term rates to do the same. The results, admittedly, have been somewhat mixed, but generally positive. I think it is conceded that we would not be in the positive situation we are now had the Fed not acted in the way that it had in 2008. But with mission nearly accomplished, and with signs that a lot of what the Fed has done are no longer having the same impact, the Fed has begun the process of first reducing its asset purchases, and later on next year we think that they will gradually start removing their support for the economy, of course contingent on the notion that it is no longer needed. All of you following the Fed know it has two mandates. One is to bring unemployment down, hopefully to a full employment level that most of us think is about 5.5. You can see that on the left, still some gap in that picture. And the Fed has a target for inflation of 2%. And in one of the more unusual things for a young man who was raised here in Chicago during the Rust Belt and the energy crises, we have inflation in the United States that's actually very low. It's only about 1%. And the Fed is really wanting it to be more predictable and get it closer to 2. So there's still some ways to go, but again, I think the Fed has been on the right course and gradually will get itself back to normal. We had a transition at the top of the table last February. I hope that all of you are getting to know Janet a little bit better. She has two tough acts to follow, but I think as you get to know her, the quality that she'll bring to the role, she's very, very smart, and more so in an organization and around a table that has a lot of different points of view. She's a very good leader, and she'll bring those opinions together, hopefully, for the benefit of the American economy. Now, finally, let me touch on a couple of things that do worry me just a little. One is that our brothers and sisters in Europe are not doing all that well. Europe is growing at barely 0.5%. And within the euro area, you have economies that are performing very well and others that are performing very poorly. If we are disappointed at our levels of unemployment, one only has to go to countries on the periphery of Europe. Anybody been to Spain, Italy, Portugal, or Greece in the last year? I mean, you can notice it almost immediately. Well-trained, well-intentioned young people with good university degrees with no hope of finding work, with youth unemployment at 50%. The European Central Bank does not have the tools that the Fed does to address this, and as a result, they're dealing with falling prices, high unemployment, and a series of ill banks that are not able to lend at exactly the moment that Europe needs more credit. Just briefly, Europe is a community of about 330 million people whose national income collectively is almost the same as it is here in the United States. And it's convenient to say, well, that's their problem, they're far away. But the companies that operate here do a lot of business over in Europe, and the profits derived by the American companies that are probably in many of your portfolios are largely taken from places outside of the United States. Just one way of saying that we are wrapped up in the fortunes of other markets and need to pay attention to them. And then finally, China is also experiencing a very challenging beginning to the year. Let me describe a series of circumstances. You have credit that has just exploded much faster than the economy has grown. You have a housing bubble. You have investors who have put their money in the shadow banking system, in instruments that they likely do not understand fully. Where does this sound familiar? I've seen this movie before. It describes the United States in 2006, but it also describes China in the year 2014, as it tries very hard to preserve the high rates of growth that are essential not just for its economic achievement, but also to achieve their social goals and avoid social unrest. As they try and bring discipline to finance while keeping the economy going, They're finding it a very difficult balancing act, which once again has very important implications for United States companies and world markets. So we've come a long way since the financial crisis of 2008-2009. Many people have asked me, from my perspective at the Fed, what did it look like? And I tell you, it was pretty dark, very dark. And we're fortunate to gather today. And while there are challenges on the horizon, we can address them from a position of relative strength, and we should all be thankful for that. But there's still hard work to do, and I certainly hope that the forecast that I've shared, which is that the economy will be helping us and not hurting us, is one that makes all of your jobs easier. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we have a few moments to take questions. If you'll raise your hand and shout them out, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
Why is Germany doing so well?
Sure. Question is, why is Germany doing so well? Relatively speaking, they've done several things that we would do well to follow. They've done a pretty good job of watching their government spending, and they've done a very good job of investing in their labor system. People in Germany get the training that they need to accept the jobs that are available. And some of the apprentice models that they have there form the core of some of the job-type programs that are being contemplated at the state and the national level here. So they've had the kind of discipline, they're very good exporters, but I think their success may be limited because some people have asked, well, why don't they just, taking Greece just an example, why don't they just kick Greece out of the euro? It's because Germans sell a lot of Wusthof knives to Greek chefs. So if Greece were to leave, it would be very bad for Germany, believe it or not. Everything comes back to cooking for me, so that's why I use that particular example. What else can I tell you? Don't be shy. In the back. Would I credit the president for the improvement in the economy? I've been following the economy for 35 years, and inevitably, the leader, whether it's the president or the head of the Federal Reserve, gets way too much credit when things are going well and way too much blame when things are going poorly. The performance of our economy really rests on a lot of actors doing their jobs well. Certainly, the president and the administration setting the toll, the Congress in establishing legislation, the Federal Reserve in setting interest rates right, but more importantly, it's all of us as we operate as citizens, consumers, and proprietors. We need to do the right sorts of things. In general, there's been, some good things that have come out of Congress and the administration, but there are also some things I know that are on people's minds that we'll need to really take care of. I think in many cases, though, if government can try not to get in the way of the private sector, typically we will get very, very good results, and we have over history. That's it. Again, thank you for your attention. It was a treat to be with you this morning.